a Hogwarts story, brought to you by Cozy Questline, a day in the life of Madam Pince. Morning, the keeper of the stacks. The first light of dawn crept through the narrow window of Madam Pince's quarters, painting a pale stripe across the foot of her narrow bed. Madam Pince woke before the sun had cleared the horizon, as she always did. Years of guarding the Hogwarts library had trained her body to rise with the castle itself. The air in her small mezzanine quarters was cool, scented faintly with parchment and the faint tang of lamp oil from the night before. She swung her legs from the bed, her feet finding the worn rug with practiced ease, and crossed to the wardrobe. Her quarters were as orderly as the shelves below, a single bed neatly made, a wardrobe with its doors closed flush, and a small writing desk positioned beneath the window that overlooked the Black Lake. This morning, the water lay still as glass, reflecting the faint blush of sunrise. A lone squid tentacle broke the surface for a moment before slipping soundlessly back into the depths. Against the far wall stood her most prized possession, a modest bookcase of her own private collection. These were volumes she would never entrust to the general stacks. Rare annotated editions with brittle pages and margins filled with the careful script of long-dead scholars. Some were bound in cracked leather, others in faded cloth, their spines softened by centuries of handling. She ran a fingertip along them as she passed, a silent morning greeting. Her robes hung in perfect order, high-collared, the cuffs faintly ink-smudged from years of handling quills and ancient tomes. She selected the day's set, smoothing the fabric with a brisk hand before fastening each button. A quick twist of her hair into its severe knot, and she was ready. The spiral staircase behind her desk creaked softly under her tread as she descended into the library proper. The vast room lay in shadow, the tall shelves looming like silent sentinels. She paused at the threshold, eyes narrowing as she scanned for any sign of disturbance. Peeves had been in a meddlesome mood yesterday, and she half expected to find theories of transubstantial transfiguration tucked into the herbology section again, or a stack of Muggle Studies pamphlets wedged between the encyclopedia of toadstools. Sure enough, a single book lay face down on a reading table, a compendium of curses and counter-curses, its ribbon marker dangling over the edge. She clicked her tongue, lifted it with care, and sent it floating back to its rightful place with a precise flick of her wand. Satisfied, she moved to the tall windows and unlatched the enchanted shutters. They swung open with a soft sigh, letting in the first pale wash of morning light. Dust motes stirred in the beams, drifting lazily through the air like tiny golden spores. The library seemed to breathe in the light, the shadows retreating to the far corners. At her desk, she set a small copper kettle on the brazier and measured out a spoonful of strong black tea. The water began to hum and steam, the scent curling into the air and mingling with the dry perfume of old paper. She poured herself a cup, the warmth seeping into her fingers as she took the first measured sip. Only then did she cross to the great oak doors, draw the heavy iron key from her belt, and turn it in the lock. The hinges of the great door gave a low groan of protest. The day's guardianship had begun, and Madam Pince was ready to defend her domain. Midday, the librarian at work. By midday, the library was at its busiest, though busy here meant a low, constant murmur of turning pages, the occasional scratch of quill on parchment, and the faint rustle of robes as students moved between the stacks. Madam Pince sat at her high desk like a watchtower sentinel, her posture straight, her eyes sweeping the room with the precision of a hawk. A pair of second years in the charms section began whispering over a diagram of wand movements. Without a word, she fixed them with a single piercing glare over the rim of her spectacles. The effect was immediate. Their voices died mid-sentence, and they bent over their work with exaggerated focus. Satisfied, she returned to the ledger in front of her, dipping her quill in ink with a measured hand. When a student approached to return a stack of books, she didn't rise. Instead, she gave a small flick of her wand. The tomes lifted from the boy's arms, floated neatly onto the desk, and stacked themselves with a soft thump. Another flick, and they drifted away into the aisles, slotting themselves precisely into their rightful places. She prided herself on never misshelving a single volume. The thought of a book out of order was enough to make her jaw tighten. Her gaze, however, kept straying to the far corner of the library, where the rope marking the entrance to the restricted section hung in its usual place. A trio of older students had been loitering there for several minutes, pretending to browse the adjacent shelves. She knew the signs, the sidelong glances, the feigned disinterest. Rising silently, she crossed the floor, her robes whispering against the flagstones. The students startled at her approach, one of them hastily shoving a slip of parchment into his pocket. "Unless you have a signed note from a professor," she said, in a voice as crisp as frost, "you've no business beyond that rope." They muttered apologies and retreated, their footsteps quickening as they made for the safer territory of the History of Magic section. Madam Pince lingered a moment longer, eyes narrowing as she scanned the restricted section's shadowed shelves. The wards shimmered faintly in her peripheral vision, intact for now. Professor requests. By early afternoon, the steady trickle of students gave way to a different kind of visitor, the professors. They came with purpose, their footsteps brisk, their requests precise, and Madam Pince treated them with the same measured formality she afforded everyone else. Rank, in her eyes, did not exempt one from the rules. The first to arrive was Professor Flitwick, his head barely visible over the counter until he stood on tiptoe. He offered her a neatly folded slip of parchment, signed and dated, requesting The Theory of Wandless Casting, a dense, leather-bound volume whose gilt title was almost worn away. Madam Pince retrieved it without hesitation, her wand tracing a silent summoning charm. The book floated from its high shelf, landing with a soft thump on the counter. She inspected it for dust, smoothed the cover, and slid it toward him with a nod. Later, the library door swung open with a sharper motion, and Professor Snape swept in, his robes billowing like a storm front. His voice was low but edged with impatience as he requested Moster Potente potions, a grimoire so notorious it was kept under triple ward in the restricted section. Madam Pince's eyes narrowed. "Permission slip," she said crisply. Snape's lip curled. "Surely my standing clearance—" "Expired last term," she interrupted, producing a ledger from beneath the desk. "All restricted section access must be renewed annually, even for you, Professor Snape." For a moment, the air between them seemed to tighten, but Snape produced the required parchment. Signed, she noted with satisfaction, by the headmaster himself. Only then did she rise, her keys jangling softly as she crossed to the rope-barred entrance. The restricted section admitted her with a faint shimmer of wards, the air inside cooler and tinged with the scent of dust and something faintly metallic. She moved between the tall, shadowed shelves until she reached a locked glass case. With a murmured, unlocking charm, the case opened, and she withdrew the grimoire, its chain slithering free with a faint clink. Back at the desk, she placed the book before Snape with deliberate care. "Return it in the condition you received it," she said, her tone making it clear that this was less a request than a binding command. Throughout the day, other professors came. Sprout for a rare herbology compendium, Vector for an obscure text on arithmantic theory, and each was met with the same meticulous process. No matter their title or tenure, they signed the ledger, presented their slips, and received their books under her watchful gaze. For Madam Pince, the library's treasures were not merely resources, they were living artifacts of knowledge, and she was their guardian. Whether the borrower was a nervous first year or the most senior of staff, the rules were the same, and she enforced them with unwavering precision. Afternoon, the restricted section. The knock at Madam Pince's archivum door came precisely at 2 o'clock, brisk, efficient, and unmistakably Professor McGonagall's. Madam Pince rose from her desk, smoothing her ink-smudged cuffs before unlatching the door. McGonagall stood there, her expression tight, a long, narrow parcel wrapped in dragonhide cradled in her arms. "Confiscated from a 7th year," she said, her voice clipped. "A cursed transfiguration manuscript. I trust you'll see it's properly contained." Pince inclined her head, accepting the weight of the parcel. Even through the dragonhide, she could feel the faint, unpleasant thrum of magic, like a heartbeat that wasn't her own, slow and deliberate, as though the book were aware of being handled. Without another word, she turned toward the far end of the library. The main reading room was hushed, the few students present instinctively lowering their eyes as she passed. At the back, the rope marking the restricted section hung in its usual place, thick, braided, and faintly warm to the touch, as if it retained the heat of all the secrets it guarded. She leaned close and whispered the password, a single sibilant word that seemed to dissolve on her tongue. The wards shimmered faintly, like heat haze over stone, and the rope slackened. The air beyond shifted, cooler and heavier, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of old magic. The entrance yawned open. She stepped inside. Restricted section 1st floor, the safer shadows. The 1st floor of the restricted section was dim, the light from the main library fading almost entirely once Madam Pince stepped past the rope. Here, the tall shelves crowded close overhead, their carved oak uprights worn smooth by centuries of use. The air seemed denser, as though the weight of the knowledge contained here pressed down on the space itself. These were the safer forbidden works, if such a term could be applied at all. Grimoires of advanced hex theory sat in neat, intimidating rows, their spines stamped with faded gilt lettering in Celtic, Latin, Greek, and runes older still. Treatises on magical ethics, bound in sober brown leather, exuded the faint scent of dust and ink, while the histories of dueling, some so detailed they read like step-by-step manuals, bore the scars of heavy use, frayed corners, singed edges, and the occasional ink blot where a reader's quill had trembled. Dust lay thick on the tops of the shelves, disturbed only by her passing. The motes drifted lazily in the narrow shafts of light that filtered down from high leaded windows, their glass clouded with age. The silence here was not the comfortable hush of the main library, but something tauter, a stillness that seemed to listen back. Small alcoves branched off the main aisle, each containing a single desk and a green-shaded lamp. The lamps glowed faintly, their light pooling in small circles on the scarred wood, leaving the corners in shadow. Some desks bore the ghostly impressions of long-finished notes, indentations in the grain where quills had pressed too hard. A faint scent of candle wax lingered, mingling with the dry perfume of old vellum. Somewhere in the stacks, a page turned of its own accord. The sound, the whisper of parchment against parchment, seemed to echo far longer than it should have, as though the shelves themselves were carrying it along. Madam Pince's eyes flicked toward the sound, but she saw nothing. Here, books sometimes shifted subtly on their own, adjusting their positions as if to better hear the footsteps passing by. She moved on, her fingers trailing lightly along the spines, feeling the subtle differences in texture. The smoothness of calfskin, the rough grain of dragonhide, the faintly oily slickness of certain enchanted bindings. Every title here was dangerous in its own way, but these were the ones she allowed herself to linger over. The deeper levels could wait. For now, she walked among the safer shadows. Her footsteps were muffled on the worn runner that stretched down the central aisle. She approached the alcove at the far end. A narrow iron staircase spiraled down to the lower floor. Here, the air grew cooler still, the light filtering through high barred windows in thin grey shafts. The shelves were taller, the shadows deeper, and the books more dangerous. Their spines stamped with titles in dead languages, some bound in materials that seemed to shift under the eye. Iron-barred balconies overlooked the central space, their gates locked with heavy chains. Restricted section, lower level, the barred heart. She descended one final staircase. The narrow staircase spiraled down like a coiled serpent, each step worn into a shallow dip by centuries of careful, deliberate feet. The iron banister was cold beneath Madam Pince's gloved hand, and the air grew noticeably cooler with every turn. When she stepped onto the lower floor, the light thinned to a spectral grey. It filtered through high, barred windows set deep into the stone walls, their glass clouded with age and grime. The beams that did make it through were fractured by the iron lattice, striping the flagstones in patterns like the bars of a cage. The shelves here were taller, their tops vanishing into shadow. The wood was darker, almost black in places, and the carvings along the uprights were worn into indistinct shapes. Perhaps once decorative, now eroded into something more ominous. The air carried a faint metallic tang, the scent of old wards layered over older magic. The very stones had absorbed centuries of enchantments. The shelves gave way to locked glass cases, heavy iron chests, and dust-shrouded statues whose eyes seemed to follow her. Crates sat bound in thick rope, their lids marked with runes of warning. Along one wall, chained books twitched faintly as she passed, their bindings rattling in protest. Iron-barred balconies ringed the central space, their gates secured with heavy chains that glinted dully in the dim light. Behind them, books sat in precise, ominous rows, their spines stamped with titles in languages most witches, wixes, and wizards had long since forgotten. Some bore no titles at all, only strange sigils that shift when looked at for too long. The air beyond the bars felt heavier. Crossing that threshold would undoubtedly press down on the lungs. A faint, cold draught stirred her robes, though the air was otherwise still. It carried with it the dry scent of parchment and something sharper. The faint, sour, acrid bite of dark protective curses. Somewhere above, movement flickered at the edge of her vision. The faint shimmer of a robed figure drifting between the upper shelves. She did not look directly at it. The ghost's presence was a constant here, as much a fixture as the shelves themselves. It never came close, but its watchfulness was palpable. A silent sentinel, whose gaze followed her every step. Whether it guarded the books or the living from them was a question Madam Pince had never asked aloud. Her footsteps echoed softly in the cavernous space, the sound swallowed quickly by the thick air. She moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the locked balconies, checking for any sign of tampering. All was in order, for now. But here, in the barred heart of the restricted section, Order was a fragile thing, and she was its keeper. At the far end, she approached an empty glass case set into the wall. With a murmured unlocking charm, the door swung open. She unwrapped the dragonhide parcel, revealing the manuscript. Its cover, a shifting pattern of ink and shadow, the title writhing just beyond legibility. The thrum of its magic was stronger here, resonating against the wards in the walls. Carefully, she set it inside, closed the case, and traced her wand along the edges. Layers of anti-tampering charms settled over it like invisible chains, each one locking into place with a faint metallic click. From the inner pocket of her robes, she withdrew a small leather-bound ledger. In her precise, spidery hand, she noted the accession. Cursed Transfiguration Manuscript. Confiscated September 22nd. Delivered by Professor M. McGonagall. Secured in Case B-17. Only when the ink had dried did she turn away, her footsteps echoing in the cold, still air. The wards hummed faintly as she retraced her path upward, the shadows of the restricted section closing in behind her like a curtain. Night, retreat to quarters. The last echo of footsteps had long since faded, and the library lay in perfect stillness. The great oak doors were locked and warded, the lamps extinguished one by one, until only the faint glow from her desk remained. Madam Pince stood for a moment in the center of the main floor, letting her eyes sweep over the rows of shelves. Each book in its rightful place, each table cleared, each chair tucked neatly in. Satisfied, she turned toward the narrow spiral staircase hidden behind her desk. The iron steps wound upward into shadow, their edges worn smooth by her own tread over countless years. As she climbed, the air grew warmer, the faint scent of parchment and polished wood rising from below. Her quarters were small but meticulously ordered, a private eyrie perched above the library like a watchtower. A single window overlooked the Black Lake, its surface now a sheet of black glass, pricked with a reflection of stars. She lit the small brass lamp on her desk, its warm circle of light spilling over the pages. The rest of the room remained in shadow, the lamplight catching only the glint of gilt lettering and the faint texture of aged paper. Outside, the wind whispered against the glass, but within, there was only the soft rasp of a turning page. Time slipped by unnoticed. Eventually, she marked her place with a ribbon, closed the book, and returned it to its shelf. The lamp was extinguished with a quiet click, plunging the room into darkness save for the faint silver wash of moonlight through the window. She lay down, the quilt drawn up to her chin, the familiar scent of parchment and binding glue lingering in the air. Below her, the library slept, silent, warded, and perfectly in order. As her eyes closed, she felt the quiet satisfaction of a keeper whose domain was secure. Every book was exactly where it should be, and with that certainty, Madam Pince drifted into dreamless sleep.